Good evening, good morning. Welcome to PSSL 6240, Political Violence and Terrorism at the George Washington University Safety and Security Leadership Program. This is the week two YouTube. Pardon me, let me see if I can, there you go. And this is, again, to cover announcements, preview last week, or review last week and preview next week. So just a couple of announcements. So you've been broken down into groups. If there's any issues or questions, please let me know. But you should be coordinating with your groups right now, particularly if you're Group 1. And Group 1 will go Thursday, January 22nd at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. There'll be an Adobe Connect session where you will brief your product, your assignment 1. Just want to be clear, if you're briefing that week, or you're briefing for that week, you will not hand in a paper. You will get a group grade for your entire project, and you'll hand me the PowerPoint slides just sometime beforehand. So that will be the presentation. The Adobe Connect sessions are not mandatory, but they're great office hours. If you're briefing, obviously whoever's briefing has to be there. But for everyone else, they're not mandatory, but they're encouraged. You'll get ideas for your own paper, and you can ask me questions face to face. For those of you who have not used Adobe Connect, it's just an online meeting platform where we'll see each other's faces, and you can brief on PowerPoint, and you can convey to the class or whoever's there your thoughts when you're briefing. So again, there's the date, time, and you'll get a web link beforehand, and all you have to do is just click on it, and you'll be entered into the Adobe Connect session. Discussion section's pretty good. I think we did a good job for this past week. The problem is, as we get further and further into the class, I know people tend to slack off. Don't slack off. What everyone's done, with rare exception, was pretty good for the first week with depth and knowledge and effort. So again, please keep that up. It only gets a little bit more harder as the weeks go by, but again, please put in the same effort you put in this past week. The other thing I'd like to add is that the paper, or the grading for the discussion section, I'll do it early this week, but most everyone will get full grade, a full 25 points for each discussion section. Do not conflate that, or the grade there, with the papers. Just because you get 100 on the discussion section doesn't mean you'll get 100 on the paper. In fact, I almost guarantee you will not get 100 on the paper. The average grade for papers are about 88, 89. I always get complaints every year. I did really well in the discussion sections, but then I got points off on the papers, and it's two different animals. Discussion section, again, I'm grading very lightly. I want your analysis, but if your analysis is flawed, I'm not going to take off pretty much anything unless it's severely flawed. Again, because I want people's opinions, people's expressions, and more in depth, or more kind of thought off the top of your head. For papers, I want more in-depth analysis. I grade it with far more critical eye. So don't be surprised, again, if you get a lower grade on your paper than you did on the discussion sections. I think the last thing I want to say is I noticed on the intro sections, the getting to know you piece, that a lot of people in this class are in the DC area. And for those of you who don't know, and the director wanted me to echo this, there is an in-class section of this program, and I am teaching the in-class for political violence and terrorism, that's over there on the Arlington campus. So I know if you're not in Arlington or not in DC, obviously this doesn't apply to you, but if you're in there, it might not be a bad idea to consider doing this in person as well. It's a little bit shorter. Most of the other classes I've seen are a little bit less intense. So that might be the benefit. I understand if you have to travel or you have odd hours, you might not be able to make the in-person section, but we don't want to rob the in-person people to pay for the distance people, or to max the distance people. So just keep that in mind, and you're welcome to sit in one of my classes if you're in the DC area. So current current events. I think, the headlines have been dominated by this attack in Paris, and it's very relevant to our studying in this class. You're going to see all sorts of things said, as I said, in the myths portion of this class. Everyone gets on cable TV after one of these attacks, and then they start making all sorts of claims about terrorism and about the threat of terrorism that are truly false. And you don't have to turn further than CNN, Fox News, MSNBC to see these claims. I'm hoping, after going through the first section, you can look with these, I call them charlatans who appear on cable news, or at least many of them are, and look at them with a little bit more of a careful eye. In fact, I've heard everything from these terrorists present an existential threat to France, something we talked about in the earlier discussion. Ironic, considering I brought up that existential threats to France were primarily from Germany during the First and Second World Wars. I've heard all these things about Europe being too inviting to overseas populations, and that's a cause for this. They reaped what they sowed. All sorts of false claims about this. The one thing that I will say that is applicable to this course is we're going to talk about EU counterterrorism, and France is part of the European Union, and we'll talk about the differences between how the U.S. and how Europe looks at counterterrorism. And you'll, when you see that class, think back to this incident, think about those different, how those different viewpoints on terrorism are. And then lastly, there is an intelligence failure. We're still getting details, so I don't want to speak too much of it, but there is definitely an intelligence failure related to what this happened. Apparently, several of the terrorists were on watch lists, and they weren't picked up, analyzed further. When we get to week 6 and we talk about intelligence failure, again, the intelligence failure from France is probably going to be more fleshed out by then, so you'll definitely see a unique comparison. And then finally, and this brings up a unique viewpoint, didn't make the headlines because of what happened in Paris, but Boko Haram, which is the terrorist organization in Nigeria, massacred 2,000 people. Why do we pay attention to Paris and not to Nigeria? I'll let you kind of think about that throughout the course. The one thing that is definitely applicable is Boko Haram, and there's a lot of controversy on it, is not on the State Department terrorism list. And because we're talking about what is a terrorist group, what is not this week, think about it. Why should Boko Haram be on the terrorist list, or should it be, or should it not be? Especially considering this what's looking like this horrific attack in Nigeria. So, just reviewing last week, and I'll go through these pretty quickly. Terrorism is an existential threat. Some of the issues that we brought up, second and third order effects, how we scare ourselves. What do we do to ourselves? Do we act irrationally? And you don't have to look beyond what happened in Boston 18 months ago on how we might have gone a little bit too overboard with police and with shutting down a city. And people say, hey, that's a problem with terrorism. Terrorism can have that effect. But we do that to ourselves. We choose to shut down Boston. We choose to have firefights on the outskirts of Boston. We do a lot to ourselves. One question, why terrorism and not other factors? And the randomness of terrorism becomes an issue. And what I mean by randomness is some of those factors I mentioned in the last lecture, and a lot of you brought this up, they're not random. Heart disease, dying from heart disease, dying from a vehicular accident. Yeah, it could be random for a vehicular accident, but you can do things to prevent yourself from dying. You can drive sober, you can wear seatbelts, you can drive below the speed limit, you can get a car that's more safety reliant. And while you can do some things on terrorism, 99% of what you do is out of your hands, unless you want to be a hermit and live in your basement for an extended period of time. Those guys in Boston, or those guys who were in the World Trade Center, there's nothing they could have done outside of living outside of major urban populations that could have stopped terrorism. So a lot of you brought up the good point, whether it's an existential threat or not, it's not on the same level of those other public policy issues I brought up in the last lecture, because it's random, subjective. You can't control for the factors that may result in a victim of terrorism. So that's just kind of food for thought. Just preview of next week. So the 4 waves of terrorism, you'll see the evolution of terrorism throughout, really, for the last 100, 130 years or so. And you'll see the lecture with those 4 waves, and you'll see how terrorism has evolved. Hopefully you'll get away that terrorism is not a recent phenomenon. It's something that's been going on even before the last 130 years, but certainly something that's happened throughout the late 19th century, 20th century, and now into the 21st century. It didn't start with Al-Qaeda. It didn't start with 9/11. And then you'll see the 2 case studies, Irgun and FLN, that are mentioned in the readings, mentioned the Hoffman, mentioned the 4 waves, but I go in depth on the lectures. And I'm going to give you a big hint here. Know those case studies for the final. Hint, hint, stomp, stomp. So the Irgun and FLN, I go into detail. Just if you didn't know, there's links to videos in those lectures I have, so click on those links and watch those videos. Those are part of the lecture, and those are, again, that'll cover the history part 1, and then the part 2 for next week. What is a terrorist? What isn't a terrorist? What is a terrorist? What isn't terrorism? 6 events I cover for the discussion section. Explain why those are terrorist acts, why they're not terrorist acts. But I'm hoping that those acts kind of let you think about the facets of terrorism. What are the things, the factors that make either this group a terrorist group or this act a terrorist act? What are the factors that differentiate it from a freedom fighter or differentiates it from a criminal act? Why should Fort Hood be considered terrorism? Why shouldn't an IED in Baghdad or in Kabul be not considered terrorism? Or should they both be considered terrorism? Or should one not be considered terrorism? And you'll see it more in detail as you go through this week. So keep up the discussion sections. I look forward to your discussion sections, and I will see you guys at the Adobe Connect session, not this week, but the following Thursday.